Hello, everybody. Nice to have you join us during our lunch laser, Leonardo Art Science Evening Rendezvous. Art Science Center has been presenting these since 2013. They were actually started in 2008 by Piero Scaruffi, who in San Francisco decided what a great idea it would be to have these kind of conversations between artists and scientists. What we're presenting today is actually unusual for us because it's a conversation between two people. And it's related to a project by Carolyn Campbell, who I've known for quite a while. Our paths crossed at the UCLA when she was at the School of Arts and Architecture. And we spent quite a few times in the Dean's conference room talking about different things going on in the arts. We've kept contact since, and I have found out through different ways that she also is doing amazing photography. And she was born in Washington, D.C., like me. So I was very excited to kind of reconnect with her and also find out how much she loves Paris. And she has a best selling book. So one thing led to another, and we're going to hear about her book, The City of Immortals, Père-Lachaise Cemetery. Relevant at this time as well. Carolyn is a summa cum laude graduate of the Maryland Institute of College of Art, and she's had positions with the Corcoran Gallery of Art, the American Film Institute, and currently is working in the Arts and Communication Specialist. She's also lecturing about the City of Immortals, and that's why we have her here. She is joined by Michael Webb, who has authored over 25 books on architecture and design. And most recently, Architects' Houses, Building Community, New Apartment Architecture, and a memoir, Moving Around, A Lifetime of Wandering. This is a book that he did while editing and contributing essays to scores of monographs. He's a regular contributor to journals in the US, Asia, and Europe. He just came in from a 3-hour Zoom call from London. So we said he's really warmed up already to talk to us about Carolyn's project. And he is also an editor at the Times and Country Life. So before he moved to the US, he directed film programs for the American Film Institute throughout the 70s and curated a Smithsonian exhibition on the history of American cinema. We're very honored to have Michael Webb and delighted to have Carolyn Campbell talk to Michael about her project. So welcome to both of you, and thank you for doing this. The floor and the Zoom is yours.
Thank you, Victoria. It's wonderful to be here. Good morning or afternoon already, Michael, whatever time zone you're in. I thought I'd start, again, we're going to be talking about cemeteries globally, but we'll start with Père-Lachaise, which is really, there's no more rewarding or historically significant than Père-Lachaise, in my opinion, which is on the northeastern section of Paris. And to those who are familiar with the city, it's the 20th arrondissement. It's a most idyllic place. It's a forest, really. In the city, there are over 5,000 trees in Père-Lachaise. So in the fall, as you see here, it's an amazing color festival of leaves. And then come springtime, you have the beautiful scent of the chestnut blossoms. So it's, even though it's a garden style cemetery, it's the largest green space in Paris. So it is considered somewhat of a park. But it's also, the layout is very urban. It's a 107-acre cityscape, really. It has winding streets, intersections, directional signage, and it became a model for cemeteries throughout the US as a place to stroll, really, and to contemplate it's a fusion of nature and sculpture and memory. It always brings to mind a favorite quote of mine by Honoré de Balzac, who is buried in Père-Lachaise. He says, "I seldom go out, but when I feel myself flagging, I cheer myself up by going into Père-Lachaise. While seeking out the dead, I see nothing but the living." I thought, let's go back a few centuries to the genesis of the founding of this was really considered a radical departure for burial grounds. Centuries of war, plus the devastation of the plague, had filled the catacombs and the church graveyards across Paris, the traditional burial places. A turning point occurred after a heavy rainstorm and a shared wall of the Cemetery of Innocents with an adjacent building collapsed, spilling thousands of corpses into the homes of unsuspecting apartment dwellers next door. Well, 18th century Parisian architects and engineers had overlooked one significant question in their urban design scheme: what to do with the ever increasing population of the dead. Those apartment residents and many other citizens complained bitterly to the young first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte. So Napoleon directed his engineers fix the problem. So Nicolas Foucault came into play. He's the prefect of the Seine. And to solve the issue, he decided to propose to Napoleon a competition to create new cemeteries on the outskirts of the city. The first ever commission of its kind was awarded to architect, urban, and landscape designer Alexander Brongniart. A former Jesuit country retreat location was found on the far eastern side of the city. Excuse me, it was really the countryside. It was a former retreat which had beautiful rolling hills. And it was now, people were not really thrilled about the long trek to the countryside for burials and visitation, nor the bishops were not too happy about losing money, but the church had no choice. They had run out of room. Foucault had a keen sense of how to appeal to the masses by creating something intriguing. He convinced Napoleon of a plan to win over all the critics as well as the hesitant clientele by naming the cemetery after Father Lachaise, the Jesuit confessor to the popular Sun King Louis XIV. He launched an inventive real estate promotion, filling the cemetery with sculptures and the remains of the famous and infamous, including Molière and La Fontaine, and the ill-fated 12th century lovers Heloise and Abelard. Needless to say, the cachet of the place was set. The grand opening of Père-Lachaise was held in the spring of 1804. Wealthy families subsequently commissioned leading architects to create grand mausoleums, while the common man chose a modest headstone in what became a model for cemeteries. Napoleon decreed that this municipal cemetery would be open to all. Michael, you had a really interesting, as I recall, history with Père-Lachaise Cemetery, did you not?
I did indeed, Carolyn. I nearly got locked in there for the night. I was so absorbed in the beauty of what I was exploring for the first time that I failed to hear the bell announcing the closing. And when I did go to try to leave, I found the gate by which I'd entered was locked and there was no custodian there. So I looked around and figured I'd sort of explore and see if I could find another gate. Couldn't. The wall is very high, much too high to scale. So I called for help and a voice on the other side of the wall responded. And I followed my savior's directions to the main gate, where a very disgruntled custodian wagged his finger sternly before allowing me to exit. But for that lucky release, I think I would have had to decide whose grave to sleep on. In your book, you focused on the history and beauty of one singular space. I relish the extraordinary diversity of burial grounds. Now, I have no religious beliefs. I'm an aficionado of English churchyards with their lichened gravestones. I particularly love this one at Kilpeck in Herefordshire in the west of England. And you find on these gravestones, those that have not been obscured by ivy or lichen, extraordinarily moving epitaphs, like one of 1799 that's always stayed in my memory. It's at Dorchester Abbey, and it reads, "Reader, if thou hast a heart famed for tenderness and pity, contemplate this spot, in which are deposited the remains of a young lady whose artless beauty, innocence of mind, and gentle manners once obtained her the love and esteem of all who knew her. But when her nerves were too delicately spun to bear the rude shakes and jostling which we meet with in this transitory world, nature gave way, she sunk and died, a martyr to excessive sensibility." And this kind of lyricism is very touching, and it comes across the centuries as though, it was somebody one knew today. In sharp contrast to the intimacy and age of these churchyard cemeteries, churchyards, the Allied war cemeteries in Flanders and in Normandy that overwhelm you with the scale of the slaughter and the military precision of their organization. Crosses and the odd Star of David are lined up like soldiers on parade. In between those extremes of old and new, personalized and anonymous, are cemeteries of every kind and culture. They link us to the past and to the lives of the famous and the obscure. There's a sense of permanence, of calm and repose, sometimes of awe and sorrow. That's a timely subject as we confront the growing toll of COVID and become ever more aware of our own mortality. In my travel memoir, Moving Around, A Lifetime of Wandering, I've included 3 dramatic cemeteries. La Recoleta is a gated community for the rich and well-born in the Beverly Hills of Buenos Aires. It's a city of the dead, which mirrors the pretensions of the adjoining district with its showy mansions. There's a theatricality in the mourning figures. A boxer emerges from his mausoleum, ready to doff his robe and clamber back into the ring. Pax, peace, is a common epitaph for bellicose generals, and there are heartrending tributes from the Jockey Club, united in grief at the death of a member. Evita finally made it to her family vault and has become a cult attraction, but her husband, Juan Perón, the Donald Trump of Argentina, came from the wrong side of the tracks and was denied admission. Everyone gets equal billing in the Mary Cemetery, located, a very well-named cemetery, I would say, located near the border of Romania and the Ukraine. Uniform wooden markers surmounted by a cross were painted by a local artist who thoughtfully prepared his own grave in advance. Each bears an image of the deceased doing his or her job on one side, and on the other side, on the reverse, at the moment of death, from an exploding stove or a violent, almost always violent, from exploding stoves to falling trees to automobile accidents, which, having experienced the ordered affair of Romanian highways, did not surprise me. The third example, Postman's Park in London, is not a cemetery, but something a little different. It's named for the Central Post Office, which is on an adjoining site, and it occupies a former churchyard. The gravestones have been moved aside to make room for ceramic plaques. And these commemorate ordinary people who perished while performing extraordinary acts of heroism. Just take a moment to read one or two of these, because they're very touching in as much as they represent a kind of moment, a moment in time, a traumatic moment. And the inscriptions are as factual as a news release, no high-flown sentiments, just a bald account of what brave citizens of every age, down to 8, I think, did on impulse to save a stranger or a sibling. This monument was created at the end of the Victorian era, and it shares the surreal quality, I think, of the other two.
I've always been fascinated by how the character of each cemetery was formed by its inhabitants. The bucolic acres of Père-Lachaise inspired American cities to create cemeteries as landscape parks that would double as healthy resorts for city dwellers. Here on the screen is Mount Auburn in Cambridge, Massachusetts, was the first rural cemetery in the United States and was granted historic significance by the government. Graceland in Chicago is laid out across the flat grounds, but has a similar balance of modest as well as grand monuments for famous citizens such as Louis Henry Sullivan, who mentored architects Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies van der Rohe. Bonaventure Cemetery in Savannah, Georgia, has highly crafted grave markers, some with elaborate sculptures, similar to those that we find in Père-Lachaise, but placed in the setting, if you can imagine, this wonderful, luxurious former Southern plantation along the Wilmington River, where Spanish moss hangs from trees above. Cemeteries became places of public recreation, a response to the social and health issues of overcrowded cities. They express the spirit of romanticism in their fusion of art and nature, and what became a really revolutionary idea of a pantheistic view of the divinity in nature, which took place in cemeteries, in contrast to the purely sectarian character of churchyards.
And Caroline, there's something else. Cemeteries serve as anthologies of architecture, expressions of private taste, but also of current fashion. And you can find every known style and a few that have been fresh minted.
Exactly. In Père-Lachaise, classical, as you see here, this Doric Greek temple to Napoleon's general Maximilian Foy, and Gothic architecture predominate. But there's also a place for the highly theatrical cemetery style, which is displayed in Highgate Cemetery in London, which seems to have taken its cue from the Hollywood production values of Cecil B. DeMille, really. Pharaohs has long been cast a spell. In France, this obsession was highlighted by Napoleon's campaign in Egypt. Obelisks and pyramids, which appeared on buildings all over Europe, became a prominent feature throughout Père-Lachaise. Today, it's a kind of a charming mix of structures with elegantly styled crypts next to oversized mansions of the dead, encircled by rows and rows of modest headstones, creating the effect of kind of an enchanted architectural theme park. The cemetery's original plan was complemented over the ensuing decades by hundreds of individual tombs created by an impressive roster of designers, sculptors, and architects, many of whom were credited with creating the significant urban plan and public structures throughout Paris. Some of those individuals are, in fact, interred within the cemetery, and Napoleon's favorite architects, Charles Percier and Pierre Fontaine, are interred together. Their tomb here is a tall stele with the classic symbol of the urn at the top and the Masonic symbols incised on the base. Etienne Viollet-le-Duc was a central figure in the revival of the Gothic style in buildings and the author of a 10-volume history of French architecture. He won the commission with a colleague to restore the Cathedral of Notre Dame, as well as taking on commissions for various tombs and monuments, including the ornate mausoleum of the Duc de Mornay in Père-Lachaise. To me, evidence of the architect's vast knowledge of design seems to displayed in this elaborate creation, which has got everything going on it. With all due respect, it looks to me like he threw every single style he could into this. De Mornay's burial place is a lively tribute to the language of stone and form through its many layered finials. It may appear to be more like an aging wedding cake, really. Sorry, Violette, but this is what it impressed me when I saw it. It's quite beautiful. In contrast to the restraint of grave markers in earlier centuries and somewhat in today, 19th century architects and sculptors indulged in high drama. They utilized the grieving female figure to a large extent throughout the cemetery as one of the most prominent characters in this theater of stone. Statues of women represented the 7 virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude, faith, hope, and charity. Powerful examples of how women embody some of the deepest qualities of the human condition. Bats, on the other hand, illustrated the eerie side of eternity. Some of my favorite, I have a full collection of bats. I didn't have the time, I would have shown them all. Skeletons or other death symbols remind the viewer that death is a part of life and unavoidable. Skulls were discouraged at one point by the city of Paris administrators, who sought to replace Christian-dominated imagery of macabre sadness with what would instead reflect a more peaceful concept of a sweet rest. After all, the earliest interpretation of the word cemetery was a place where one sleeps. Winged figures are thus found replacing the death's head or soul effigy. These figures are generally considered angels. The word angel from the Greek word angelos, which means messenger. The chief duty of an angel was to carry messages from God. I was fascinated, Michael, by the wide variety of funerary symbols you've come across in your global travels. What has stood out to you?
Well, indeed, Carolyn, each culture and each religion, of course, has their own iconography. And a good friend of mine, Arnold Schwartzman, a award-winning designer and filmmaker who made a film called The Echoes That Remain, went through some of the graveyards of Eastern Europe, finding a trove of familiar and arcane symbols. Heavenly hands felling a flourishing tree is a potent expression of a life cut short that might just as easily have been incorporated into a Christian cemetery, as is this one, a winged hourglass and a snake swallowing its tail, which expresses the fleeting nature of time and the concept of eternity. But the shofar, a ram's horn, heralds the coming of the Messiah, and that is, of course, a much more specifically Judaic image. Muslim tombstones have their own distinct character, enhanced by the beauty of Arabic script, as in this example in a graveyard in Istanbul. In Western cemeteries, tombs often express wealth and power, as in the Clark family mausoleum at Hollywood Forever, and sometimes celebrate popular entertainers. This cascade is the memorial of Al Jolson, a very popular singer, actor in the interwar period, who would never be allowed now because he often performed in blackface. This is at the Hillside Memorial Park, and the cascade is a familiar sight to those heading south on the 405 to LAX. The truly famous need only the simplest of markers. The grave of President Kennedy at Arlington National Cemetery, just outside Washington, has nothing but an eternal flame and a very simple plaque. And that of his brother, Robert, who might have been one of our greatest presidents, is equally restrained.
Speaking of restraint, Michael, I discovered that the 300-acre Forest Lawn Memorial Park here in Glendale, California, intentionally chose simple bronze or granite markers embedded in the grass to sustain the illusion of an Arcadian landscape. It is the most popular of the different burial site options there at the Memorial Park. Forest Lawn's website promotes unparalleled views of the Los Angeles skyline, as well as notable sites and landscapes within the Memorial Park. I was curious, do the dead care what the view is? However, I soon discovered that the Memorial Park focuses a great deal on family and their priorities and their visitation, and prides itself on the fact that it not only serves the deceased, but also the living.
The location of the grave, whether it's with a sweeping view or the physical location, is as important in death as in life. For Christians, for example, it was a privilege to be buried within a church, as close as possible to the altar. You know, that brought you greater sanctity. And devout Jews compete for scarce space on the Mount of Olives, where they hope to be first in line for resurrection. Burials there date back 3,000 years, and a multitude of tombs overlook the walled city of Jerusalem. Sarajevo was once a model of multiculturalism, and three faiths lived and were laid to rest alongside each other. The Jews and the Muslims and the Christians. And Serb nationalists sought to destroy that harmony, much as the Nazis smashed Jewish cemeteries in their effort to eradicate the race, as here in Prague, where the gravestones survive, but in terrible disorder. In Mexico, where Catholicism, pre-Columbian traditions often merge together, Mexicans embrace the idea of death, creating colorful cemeteries and reaching out to the deceased with altars, and on the Dia de las Muertes, picnics beside family graves, where food and drink are shared with the deceased.
My literary hero, Oscar Wilde, initially drew me to Père-Lachaise. An artist exhibition opening heard I was planning my first trip to Paris, and he told me that his ancestor, Sir Jacob Epstein, sculpted the monument marking Wilde's burial place. Needless to say, I had my first destination. Wilde is one of the most highly visited graves, along with composer Frédéric Chopin. But Chopin is here, but all but his heart are interred in this lovely monument. It was removed by his request and placed in a church by his sister, who traveled back to his hometown of Warsaw, Poland. Burial rites are a big part of the mystique of those interred in Père-Lachaise. Many doubted that Jim Morrison even died, much less actually buried there. However, I interviewed several members of the Doors, including one of their managers, who attended the modest 6 minutes in length burial service. To avoid the threat of mobs and the paparazzi, the Paris officials were not given Morris's real name right up until the very last moment before they made plans for the burial and had to sign the death certificate. He was laid to rest in a simple wooden casket in a location hidden by 2 tall tombs purposely and with no headstone. There was just a dirt-covered mound. Anonymity was the plan. That all changes on July 3rd every year, the anniversary of Morrison's death. Throngs of fans, numbering in the thousands, descend on the cemetery. Police have to come and corral the long lines of fans winding all the way out the cemetery's front gates. This brings to mind about how one qualifies to be buried in Père-Lachaise. Either one needs to be born in Paris, their family has a crypt there, or one dies in Paris. Jim did the latter. Michael,
in Venice, I went to the island. In Venice, I went to the island cemetery of San Michele to pay my respects to Igor Stravinsky. The composer loved the city, in which he premiered some of his late works, including The Rake's Progress at the Teatro Fenice, and he asked to be buried next to his early patron, Serge Diaghilev, in the Russian Orthodox section. Flowers, votive candles, and a ballet slipper show that the great impresario is still revered.
Most Venetians, Michael, curiously enough, opt for a humbler resting place, a niche in a columbarium, as is common throughout Southern Europe and increasingly in the North in Père-Lachaise. It's cheaper and requires less maintenance. However, no matter what style of grave marker you choose, the policy is clear: you must pay to stay. If you don't keep up with the random Père-Lachaise, or you do not maintain the tomb due to negligence, your remains can be transferred to the cemetery's ossuary, which is located, you'll see the two doorways on either side of this large monument titled Au Mort, or To the Dead. Or you could choose to have your ashes scattered in the Garden of Memory, which is along the northern wall.
That's a choice that more people are making, especially in the US, where cemeteries are running out of space and traditional burials can be extortionately expensive. In Northern Europe, around 80% of people choose cremation. In Japan, it's almost universal. Expensive cemeteries are a relic of the past, and few new ones are being created. Britain leads the way in natural burial, having established nearly 300 rural sites where bodies can be buried in biodegradable shrouds that will enrich the surrounding woodlands. The environmentally conscious often choose to have their ashes scattered at sea, forfeiting a marker but sparing descendants the trouble of maintaining a grave.
My parents were pretty considerate, as well as being environmentalists, and they chose cremation. So my sisters and I spread their remains in the Pacific Ocean. Personally, I'm an earth sign, and I'm considering having my ashes scattered under a tree in what I've discovered is one of these new forest-style memorial groves here in California. And I suspect I'll probably arrange to have a few of my particles sent to some friends in Paris and ask them to sprinkle a bit of me in Père-Lachaise.
Carolyn, monks came up with a space-saving solution centuries ago. Their bones were neatly stacked, or, as in the Sedlec ossuary in the Czech Republic, artfully arranged to compose a memorial. Like the Mary Cemetery, like the altars and candy skulls of the Dia de las Muertes, Sedlec is a triumph of human creativity that thumbs its nose at death.
Thank you, Michael. Well, I hope everyone has enjoyed our trek through the afterlife. And I believe there may already be some questions that have been posed. And I did want to note that they're I believe at the top of the chat, there is a link. Our mutual publisher, Goff Books, is offering a 20% discount on both Michael's book on wanderings and my own book on City of Immortals. So please take advantage of this generous discount from Goff Books. So are there any questions?
This was really wonderful, and it was nice to have both points of view. I was really amazed. And Lindsay, who often attends our lasers, had some good comments. Lindsay, did you want to say something, or do you want us to read what you wanted to share? Lindsay, are you there?
Maybe I can just read it for Lindsay, Victoria.
Okay, thank you.
Lindsay says, my grandpa helped his neighbor, who sold headstones by making models of them. I have those that I could find. My mom was highly skilled at figure drawing and sketched an angel for one, which was sculpted and resides in a Chicago cemetery. And also Jim Morrison went to UCLA.
Yes, you did. Yeah.
Who knew?
One of the people that I interviewed, his name was Alain Ronet, was in the film department with Jim, and they stayed close throughout all of these years. And Alain Ronet was the one who verified for me that Jim Morrison, in fact, did die. He and Agnes Varda made the arrangements to move. Agnes knew the police in Paris and kept everything on the down low, did not reveal the name, so that they were able to bury him in secrecy. So this is wonderful story. Alain, unfortunately, just passed away. He'd been living in Hollywood for many years, and I was lucky enough to meet him.
So I'm curious to hear from both of you how you're seeing, from your perspective, all the deaths that are going on around us now and the burials that a lot of times people are actually unprepared for. What is your perception on this grim reality we're dealing with right now?
Carolyn, you want to go first on that?
Sure. Because I've been, somehow my life seems to be about a fair amount of death these days, only because of my passion for Père-Lachaise and becoming very interested in the cemeteries worldwide. I talked to a few contacts I've had at local cemeteries, and interestingly enough, the pandemic has caused a surge in purchases of cemetery plots.
Mm-hmm.
I spoke to someone at Rose Hill Cemetery in Whittier, which is the largest, I had no idea, it's 1,600 acres, that people tend not to pre-plan. And unfortunately, this is to the detriment of families' emotions. The death happens, they're devastated, and they have no strategy. So people are now thinking ahead, and there's been a surge on the only person that's probably doing really great business these days are cemeteries. They're selling plots amazingly fast, he said. So that's in one aspect that seems very evident.
And Mike?
I think that the fact that the COVID pandemic has focused our attention on our vulnerability, the fact that anybody can be struck down at any time, will change the way we think about making plans, whether it's prepaying for a site or whether it's making arrangements for cremation or scattering of ashes. It takes some urgent outside event to focus us on things that we should be focused on anyway, but tend to put off, either because we're squeamish about thinking about it, even though we know that all of us eventually will die. But I think they will change, just as a program like this may change the whole custom of gathering in a room and conversing around a table or from a stage, and turn it into a virtual rather than a live event.
So Carolyn, at the end, you were talking about your own ashes and the idea of earth and you being an earth sign. Have you also looked into or think about the whole idea of reincarnation or non-toxic burials? There's all kinds of new ways to think about how we go back to the earth we came from.
Well, my own kind of meditation practice is that I'm hoping to take care of a lot of the karma in this life so that if I come back around again, it may be a little less stressful. Maybe there won't be another Trump in the future, who knows? But I was looking into this environmental thing because I'm very much, the expense of caskets, and I mean, you see some of the wrappers have these 24 karat gold elaborate things. And I was talking to a few of the people who have these forests. There's one in the Redwood area up north of San Francisco, and they literally just wrap you in a shroud and drop you into the earth. I'm really keen. My poor niece is my executor of my estate. And she's got to deal with all this junk in this condo and all of these books. And I thought, I've got to really make this low maintenance on her. So I thought cremation, which I did price out, they're anywhere from $300 to $700, all the way up to the high end for $3,000 just for a simple cremation. So I'm going to factor that into my trust because I know that how traumatic this is. My mother, God bless her, she took care of all of this so that, we knew both she and Dad wanted to be cremated, and we were just left with her 2 garage fulls of pottery that we had to get rid of. But so I think it's, as Michael said, having these conversations in advance. Who want to have grand, memorials or a big wake. I'm Irish, I'm all for that, bring a couple of jugs of you know, Jim Beam, and we'll all sit around and chat. But yeah, it's a lot for people. And I think we really have to get off of this taboo about death.
Yes.
And that's hard because that's really instirred in all of us,
right? I would urge everyone to read The American Way of Death by Jessica Medford, which was published many years ago, but is still highly relevant, which explores the really obscene exploitation of grieving relations when it comes to planning a funeral, those who have not made plans in advance and who are in effect hustled into paying for an elaborate casket or some elaborate embalming procedure, which they would never have contemplated had they had time to think it through. And it's a warning about leaving everything to the last minute. You've got to make plans ahead of time, the same way as you would plan, you know, what school to send your child to or what profession to take up. I think it's a common sense thing. And this book really underlines the urgency of doing that. I do feel that, you know, as we become ever more environmentally conscious, that it does make sense to consider all the options that sit as lightly on the land as possible or in the land. And the idea of a forest grove as a resting place without a marker, but with the knowledge that I'll be surrounded by, you know, fertile greenery is very appealing to me.
So the part of the problem, of course, is the taboo. In America in particular, Carolyn, you actually ended what you just said with that there's this taboo, and it really is. It's people just somehow don't want to talk about death or plan it, and then become victim of this kind of situation, and it's happening en masse now, and nobody's really even talking about it now. So this book, to me, and this conversation for that matter, really brings it to the forefront to really look at death in the face and understand the transitory nature of our lives and how short of a time we have here and how important it is to leave a mark, right? And that mark, to be environmentally conscious now, I think is so important. I really appreciate this this whole way of approaching it, where it doesn't feel intimidated, it doesn't feel dark. It's and at the same time, you could dig deeper and then find all kinds of different layers. Yes.
Well, oddly, it's there. We seem to have swung back when you're thinking the 19th century architects, and I don't know if the architecture field in general knows that they were pivotal in switching away from that old Christian, dark, deep, scary pestilence, disease in a cemetery to this pantheistic view of the beauty of nature. And that's why they love the idea of a garden style cemetery where you could contemplate and have loving memories of your lost ones. And unfortunately, I don't know where in societal strains it changed, because I'm talking to my friends in Paris now, and they said, oh no, everybody is literally mentally shut down, that all the taboos have set in again. No one wants to talk about death. And I thought, what happened from between the 19th and 21st centuries that everybody started to shut down? And because all of these beautiful American cemeteries, there's ones in Washington, D.C., Rock Creek and Oak Hill, many across the country, beautiful, bucolic, garden-style cemeteries. And yet, again, this whole idea of denial of death, I don't know what it's going to take. I mean, in Buddhist traditions, it's a death practice where you literally live with the fact that death could happen any time. How are you living the present? Really brings it right up into your face about how are you living your life. And so,
then of course, sorry.
No, I just wanted to pick up on that point Carolyn made. Why did we go from the more, let's say, open eyed view of death and what we should do about it in the 19th century to the present. I think the fact is that in the 19th century, where outbreaks of influenza or plague even still occurred, and there were no vaccines, no cures for that, where death was a much more ever-present and intimate companion of the living, where bodies were laid out at home rather than at a funeral home. People lived with death in a much more immediate way. Now we can put it out of our minds. We can turn it over to somebody else, just as we no longer have to go out and shop, but have Amazon bring everything to us. So in the same way, we can turn it over to professionals, to deal with all of the messy reality of taking care of the body and so on. So I think that is really what may change as a result of this pandemic, which again is reminding people that this is not some vague speculation in the future. It is a certainty that will sooner or later occur to everybody, and perhaps to more of our friends and family than we would like. And so maybe it will produce a more realistic and approach, and I think it will stimulate debate on all the different ways in which we would like to spend the rest of our lives, whether we believe in reincarnation or not. I don't expect to have an afterlife, but I just want to put as small a burden on the living, on my friends, as possible, and do it in a clean and effective way.
So we have a question from Alex in the audience, who's asking if you had any thoughts on the companies who are working on composting bodies as an alternative, and how that may affect the space and culture of death that we have currently.
Funny that you should mention, because I did have a conversation with someone about that, and composting, it sounds wonderful, but if you think about as it was posed to me, would I really want to take my grandmother and put her out with the worms and the bugs and the leaves and break her down, and they give you a 5-pound bag of your composted relative, whatever you want. And this funeral director was telling me, he said, everyone loves to think about the environment, but when it comes down to putting grandma in a 5-pound bag to take home and sprinkle in the vegetable garden, all of a sudden that plot out at Forest heck of a lot more, sensitive to grandma's needs. So I think it's really going to have an awakening about this juxtaposition of, again, the composting idea, when you really look at the nitty gritty of it, is, and as someone else pointed out, they did compost their relative and they put it all in the irises out in the garden. However, when it came time to sell the house, do you have to disclose to the new buyer grandma is in the irises? And someone pointed out it might be by law that you have to do that.
Oh
so
my goodness.
Again, great ideas, follow it through.
Carolyn, what is needed is a frost show to come up with some brilliant marketing strategy that makes all this sound much less threatening. I mean, the radical notion of going to a secular cemetery rather than a churchyard was accomplished in very, very short order. 20 years between the opening of Père-Lachaise and the American versions of that. So people can shift their preconceptions, their expectations very, very quickly. And I think that, compost has unfortunate connotations, but the fact is it's much more organic than cremation. Cremation, once you have ashes, it's not going to, you can scatter them at sea or on the ground, but it isn't going to enrich the land where, clearly composting would. And so would the notion of, instead of having a steel casket that will preserve the skeleton for all time, having a biodegradable shroud, something that in fact will become part of nature. I think that's frankly a lovely idea.
Well, there's some interesting legislation that's going to force people to think it through, because Los Angeles and Orange County, there is now a cap on any further expansions in cemeteries. So the plots that are available are it. So if you haven't already purchased a plot or a niche in the columbarium in an LA or Orange County cemetery, you will have to move outwards. And this might force people to consider, you know, how about the Forest Grove or that alternative? So
or it'll become like.
Sorry, go ahead.
I say what I fear there is that if indeed it is widely thought that there's going to be a shortage, that some evil person will start, you know, buying up options and then selling them on the black market like toilet paper and hand sanitizer 6 months ago.
Michael, you know this country too well.
I was going to bring up the mushroom death suit. Are you familiar with J. Rim Lee? Is an artist who proposed this, and then it actually became a thing. And if Caitlin's around, she may chime in better than I can. But the idea was to actually create a mushroom suit with spores. So when the person is buried, it actually ends up going into the earth and feeds the earth. And I believe it even turned into a kind of a startup, and there's people who wanted to be buried this way. Are you familiar with this?
I haven't heard of that. No.
No.
I would also add to that, I was thinking the same thing, Victoria. I'm glad you mentioned it. But part of what also, just to echo what Michael's saying, the thing about compost too is that, and with the death, the mushroom suit, there's a potential for the chemicals that are inherently in our bodies from living on the planet right now, that they actually will be broken down and remediated into smaller constituents. And so there's less, like a lot less of an environmental impact of our actual physical bodies going into the ground, because we are so filled with chemicals from like living on the planet. So part of what the mushroom suit was all about is actually dispersing and breaking down those chemicals as well. And compost would certainly do the same thing. So I agree with Michael, we have to kind of shift our trajectory in, again, this like away from this idealism of preservation and imagining, like, I mean, it is kind of weird to imagine a grandmother being sort of eaten by worms, etc., and being broken down into soil. But again, it takes this big shift in, you know, it's a paradigm shift. I think just going into that and actually having it be something that is helping the planet, something that's helping everyone around the deceased. And yeah.
Caitlin, are you going to be our Nicholas Frochot of the 21st century? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I love the idea. And I think this, I mean, it's so complex. I think that all of this is just so complex, thinking about cemeteries as these literally these moments of entanglement that you have these beautiful gardens, these green spaces, these areas of reprieve, as well as, you know, then there are these kind of these sites where there's all this intense, you know, potentially ecological impact, but also all this death. And then you have lichens growing on the cemetery or on the gravestones, and you have all of these plants and insects kind of interacting in the space. And I think there's a lot of potential to create these beautiful green spaces, again, echoing what Michael's saying, maybe these big forests that are kind of a lot more for the living, but in collaboration with the dead.
Well, I think Sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just going to tag on to the Tibetans actually would put people who have like prisoners or somehow criminals into coffins, because if you start visualizing the compost, but start visualizing what happens when you're actually in a box and you are so attached to the earthly realm that you're not believing that you're dead because your consciousness keeps going. So there's different ways to approach it, because yes, you imagining your grandmother and your compost and your garden can be awful, but do the same and imagine what would be with your grandmother in this gold-plated coffin that's buried, right? It's so difficult for worms and everything that's decomposing to interact with that. So it's actually a pretty horrendous way to put people away.
Well, if Grandma was a gardener, of course, it's an entirely appropriate thing and something that she would have applauded because she's been spending her life, you know, encouraging worms, which are helpful, and stomping on bugs, which are not. But seriously, what I find so fascinating about, you know, the examples that both Carolyn and I have cited is that the 19th century was really an aberration in so many ways. Up to that point, yes, there were very elaborate church memorials. Great families in England would have the leading sculptors of their day create very elaborate in-house monuments. But if you were buried outside, if you were a mere mortal, not a, you know, the lord of the manor or a duke, then you settled for what was essentially a very plain gravestone, admittedly with some beautiful carving or lettering in it. And we've gone back to that. Clearly, the forest lawn is in a way a return to the understatement, to the almost anonymity, if you will, of a 19th century, of a medieval churchyard. And so I love the fact that there are these cycles of fashion, that even though, you know, the notion of burial, Christian burial anyway, hasn't changed that much, the manifestation of it, the commemoration of it, has shifted quite radically, and as I say, has gone to the wildest excesses of expression, as seen in Père-Lachaise, to something much more like, you know, an 18th century or a medieval churchyard.
It's an interesting fact that my last visit to Père-Lachaise before everything shut down, because you can purchase plots in different levels. There's in perpetuated, which is the most expensive. So you can buy a plot till the end of time, or you rent them. I don't know anybody who would rent a plot for 10 years, 20 years. And then they just, I guess they figured the family is exhausted at that point and they just move the remains. However, I noticed that some of these old 19th century chapel style crypts, that the families were no longer in existence, the remains had been disinterred, they were repurposing them as little columbarium niches. So these chapel style things, maybe a few family bodies, were filled with like 20 little niches so people could put their ashes in there. So that they were very kind of thinking, I mean, Père-Lachaise, even though it's very much, you know, embracing the 19th century, it's now moving forward with, there's a waiting list to get there. It's becoming more elitist. Only the really wealthy can afford to be there anymore. It used to be in Napoleon's era, it was a municipal cemetery. It was for everybody. The rich could afford the elaborate mausoleums, but the poor could still have a basic headstone. But now they're trying to think, because everyone wants to be in the Paris cemetery. No one wants to be out in Banlieue someplace or something like that. So even the old style is having to rethink what they're going to do going forward. So,
but Carolyn, this is so appropriate because all the working class districts, almost all the working class districts of Paris, have been gentrified, and artisans' stores have been turned into fashion boutiques. So in a way, the same degree of gentrification is going on at Père-Lachaise as in the areas where people live.
Exactly.
The gentrification of cemeteries.
Next level.
And it's some, like La Recoleta, start out being like an exclusive nightclub that if you hadn't got an invitation or don't have the right credentials, you don't get in.
So to the next level, right?
Right.
When you're talking a lot about the 19th century, which of course is the beginning of the whole industrialized age, and do you see parallels of our kind of more mechanical or materialistic way of industrialized thinking in relation to the cemetery, or do you is that a kind of a far fetch there?
No, I don't think it was a question of industrialization. I think it was much more the Romantic movement, which heightened the drama of all kinds of things, from opera and, you know, the symphony as essentially a 19th century art form, though continued to the present. But, you know, the Sturm und Drang of Wagner, shall we say, or Verdi, is so characteristically 19th century, and, you know, larger than life. All the emotions kind of exposed and exaggerated. And I think the funeral monuments are an expression of that. The grieving angels, the exaggerated postures, the feeling that indeed it is a kind of opera of death, where now it is a chamber work or a very kind of low-key, where do we put Granny? You know, let's find a place somewhere to put her. And so I think it's a matter of social change. You know, there are plenty of people who still have strong religious beliefs, so it's not a secularization per se. Though I do think that one of the big shifts that Père-Lachaise represented was that if you weren't an Orthodox Christian, you know, of an approved kind, you didn't get in the churchyard, or you didn't get a church burial, where now it's much more ecumenical. You know, there may be a Jewish section, or certainly was a Jewish section in many cemeteries, and there are cemeteries that are entirely Jewish and presumably also entirely Muslim. But other than that, you can be a dissenter, you can have whatever strange cult belief you want, and you can still get in. So in that respect, there has been a very big shift.
Carolyn, do you want to say last few words before we
Oh boy.
take off?
I guess one of the things that drove me to research more about Père-Lachaise, and it brought me closer to all of the people that are buried there. And in the heart of the book, I have these conversations with the dead. And I gave myself a reading list that I could only read books based on individuals who were buried there. So I read the biographies and autobiographies of Isadora Duncan and Edith Piaf and Modigliani and Eugene Delacroix. And it was so enriching to go back kind of from their death, going back into their life, to learn to my appreciation, my celebration of all of these immortals in Père-Lachaise. And I guess, if anything, I get to appreciate more about the creative spirits in the world. And I appreciate my creative friends, like my dear friend Victoria and Michael. So while we're living, celebrate.
Yes, what a wonderful way to say, and we really appreciate so much what you're doing. Michael, thank you for a lifetime of wondering and wisdom and your wonderful
Thank you, Victoria.
commentary. Such wonderful commentary. And Carolyn, thank you so much. This was just lovely, and the recording remains, so we can also share it, continue sharing this if you're okay with it. Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
And may you be in peace and be healthy and safe.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.